A few days ago, I finished reading Hell Followed with Us by Andrew Joseph White, and I had rather unfortunate feelings about it. So I decided to consult the oracle of the bookish world, Goodreads, to see if more people felt the same way that I did about it. Unfortunately, I found dozens of reviews gushing about the diversity of this book, regardless of if they liked the book or if they disliked the book, which made me think, when did we start equate diversity with good quality? When did diversity become a criteria for reviewing books? Just because a book is diverse, it doesn't make it a good book, as is in the case of Hell Followed with Us by Andrew Joseph White. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Rupkat Bhattacharjee and you're watching my channel, which is named after me because I lack creativity. In today's video, I'll be reviewing the book Hell Followed with Us by Andrew Joseph White and talking about how just because a book is diverse, it isn't necessarily a good book. Like, those two things aren't synonymous at all. Let's start with the synopsis of this book. In Hell Followed with Us, we follow the story of Benji, a young trans teenager who is on the run from the cult that raised him. This cult is an evangelical, fundamentalist Christian cult that is also fascist and eco terrorist. They believe that there are too many people on this earth, and due to that belief, the founder of this cult brought about Armageddon. This Armageddon led to the decimation of the planet and apparently brought the people closer to God. To fulfill their final step, that is complete reverence to God, complete submission to God, this cult has created Benji, a young boy who was turned into a monster by them. This monster, called Seraph, is prophesied to bring humanity closer to God by destroying the planet altogether. So this book starts when Benji is on the run from this cult. He has managed to escape with the aid of his father and has now run into a group of ragtag teenagers who run the local youth center in this dystopian society for queer kids. The premise sounds excellent. I think this is one of the most unique premises that I have come across in the past few years that I began reading dystopian YA. And with the political climate in the United States of America, with religion being mixed with the judiciary more and more often, I think that such a book would have been very good if it was written way better. Unfortunately, in Hell Followed with Us's case, the execution was terrible. No matter how good the premise was, it couldn't be the book's saving grace. Starting with what I absolutely disliked about this book was the characterization. Now, this book has a huge cast of characters despite the fact that it is told by first person limited point of view. Our main character Benji is paper flat. He has no personality except for being sad. I mean, a piece of toast might perhaps have more personality than him. He is a very one dimensional character and overall not memorable at all. When I'm reading a book, I prefer to read about compelling characters. I am a person who prefers characters over plot a lot of times. I mean, a book could have a very basic plot, but I could possibly rated more than 3 stars just because I liked the characters. For Hell Followed with Us, it had neither characters nor a good plot. We'll get into that later. Now, speaking about the issue of diversity, it is true. Hell Followed with Us has an extremely diverse cast, not only in sexuality or gender but also race, religion, etc. etc. But the problem with this very diverse cast is that none of the characters have any personality. They only have self assigned diversity quota that they have been given to fill up in this book, which makes me feel that the inclusion of these characters was just to show how educated and open minded the author is. For instance, why don't we take the example of two characters, Salvador and Erin, in this book? Both of them have one assigned personality trait. Erin is the mother hen of their group, and Salvador is a sarcastic person. That's it. In every one of their lines, both of them showcase this singular personality trait of theirs. Was this laziness on the part of the author? Was this the depiction of the author's poor craft in writing characters? We will never know. Moving on, the love interest of this book, also known as Nick, is the leader of these group of rebellious teenagers. Nick too has no personality. Nick makes craft lizards and is unable to depict his emotions very well, and that is his whole personality. Honestly, every line of dialogue between the two characters was them discussing either Benji's one personality trait, that is, he is sad and conflicted, or Nick's one personality trait, that he makes craft lizards. And most of the time, many characters who were introduced in the book were introduced with just one line which felt very ingenuine, like, "Hi, this is my name, these are my pronouns, this is my sexuality, my race, etc., etc." And that's it. That was the entire line. I felt that this could have been revealed in a better way, or just left unsaid. As you might notice in many fantasy novels, authors don't just say it out loud, but it is indicated through the prose, etc., like pronouns. One such example would be Cryer's War, where people just don't go around saying that, "Hi, my pronouns are they, them." It is just implied through the prose because the prose uses that when referring to that certain character. On top of all that, the politics in this book is bizarre. It makes no sense in a future dystopian world for these teenagers, some of them who were raised in a cult, to have such information about like conservationism, progressiveness, etc., etc. These children were raised in a cult after the end of the world was already brought upon them. I really don't understand why the author chose to make, even if the authors chose to make politics such a big deal in this book, why he chose not to expand more on it. I felt like if the author chose to introduce more politics to this book would have been way more compelling to read. But since the author stuck to the teenage angst, because obviously it's a YA book, it's probably my fault for expecting a YA book to be nuanced and political. This book was literally torture for me. There is no nuance in this book. And by that I mean, since this book deals with religious trauma and religion as a whole, it has no nuance when depicting religious characters. All religious characters, except for one in this book, are the villains. And that one religious character's religious dilemma about living in a world where religion has been transformed to a cult and one religion dominates the rest and has brought about the end of the world is only addressed in a throwaway line, and that too to add to the emotional trauma of the main character. I felt that if the author were to handle a precarious subject like religious trauma in such a great deal, he must have included more nuance to this. Why not discuss more deeply what happens when you do believe in this religion but don't necessarily agree with the people who are persecuting others in the name of this religion? What about other characters who follow other religions? How does this affect their relationship with their beliefs? Unfortunately, there was nothing of that sort in this book. The author chose to include biblical allusions that make no sense rather than expanding more upon the very ethos of his novel. Talking about biblical allusions, do not even get me started on that. Our main character Benji will not stop comparing himself to literally every page of the Bible that has ever existed. Every single chapter, there are at least five biblical allusions being shoved down my throat. If I had to go through that, I would rather read the Bible again. I mean, I have it in my desk somewhere right now because I had to give a test on it for 4 consecutive years, I believe, in my school. These biblical allusions, if they were done cleverly, would have added to the prose of this book, which is rather bland from the beginning. But if they were done cleverly, this could have enhanced the writing style, the narrative voice of this novel. But unfortunately, most of these allusions did not make any sense, but were rather a throwaway reference to Benji's upbringing in the cult. And of course, everyone who has been in a religious cult will obviously reference that very same religion every single moment, according to the author. Moving on, let's talk about the world building, or the lack thereof, because there is no world building. It feels like I was thrusted in the second book of a duology before reading the first book, because it seems like a large chunk of the story is absolutely missing. Many questions that arose in me during my reading of this book was: number one, what was the Armageddon? Number two, how was Benji turning into a monster? Number three, how did the cult even come to rise? So basically, any and all questions that should have been explained in the novel, since it is a dystopian novel, will be questions that will be left unanswered till the end of this novel. Many things were left unsaid, and the author clearly disregarded their world building and character development to just have for deep writing that doesn't make sense, overwrought prose that tries too hard to be poetic. One of the major things that struck me when I was reading this book was how America centric this novel was. I mean, I wouldn't have expected anything more from a young adult novel set in dystopian America, but it still made me laugh a lot. Since this is a world where fundamentalist evangelical Christians have taken over the world, and the majority of this cult is situated in America, as is evident by Benji's entire presence. What is going on in majority Buddhist countries like China, or majority Hindu countries like India, or majority Islamic countries, or countries that have a mix of all forms of religion where the majority religion is not Christianity? What is happening in those nations? Because it makes no sense that if one country had been toppled, surely, since America has a very big part in the global trade, economy, and international politics, other countries would face a lot of difficulties. But since they're seeing that the condition of the US is not improving, they probably would have they're gone in their own business, since it is evident through the entirety of the novel that there are non cult survivors of this entire Armageddon. So, this would lead the reader to assume that other countries also had said survivors. So, what is happening in those countries? Are those countries like the author just assumed that all of the other countries are dead and only these few people are left? Or are those countries just not a part of the geography in this world? I mean, it is a future post apocalyptic scenario, so I am assuming the other 194 or 193 nations still exist in this world. I'm pretty confused about how the things work out, and it is also pretty stupid to me. And since I've spoken about the prose and narrative voice for a few times in this video, to expand more on it, the writing is pretty simplistic and it reads like fanfiction that an angry 13-year-old would have written on Wattpad. The book should have gone through a few more rounds of editing to cut down the unnecessary biblical allusions and allegories and shorten down the self-guilt and self-hatred monologues that our main character was going on multiple times. Now, talking about the genre of this book was marketed as horror. Mind you, it was not marketed as a subgenre of horror or body horror. It was marketed as the overarching genre of horror. But it has no horror elements in it. There is no suspense to the book. There is no creeping feeling of dread in this book. Many horror authors, like many prolific horror authors, do not rely on a cheap plot twist or a cheap shock to convey the horror of their book. They convey the horrifying feelings through the atmosphere of their novel, and this book lacks atmosphere. This book has a narrative voice that can do nothing but portray simplistic actions or character descriptions. I feel like for a debut novel, those things are pretty expected, but for a debut novel that has a 4.22 rating on Goodreads, I would have expected eons better writing and better horror as well, since this book's main genre is being listed as horror. This does have some body horror and gross depictions of vomiting and other visceral stuff, but that horror too is more disgusting rather than horrifying. So I wouldn't really call this a horror book, but rather just post apocalyptic dystopian like the other genres of this book already are. With the review out of the way, I would expand more on why I think diversity has now become a marketing quota for publishers to fill rather than genuine writing for representing characters. Own voices and diverse books have now become taglines for publishers to stamp on their books, hoping to sell more copies. Now, most people nowadays wish to read diversely, not because they genuinely search out for books written by authors of color and queer authors, but so that they can show how educated and how much they care for the outer world, which is a major reason why some of the reviews here, even if they rated the book 1 star or 2 stars or outright disliked the book, they in their reviews they wrote diversity 5 out of 5, which made me thinking, does diversity really matter when these characters are literally personality less. What is the difference between a boring white character and a boring character of color? There is no difference. Both of these characters are still boring. I feel like authors don't realize that just because you swap the race of your character from white to, let's say, black or brown, it doesn't change the fact that your character is still not compelling for the reader to continue on. Just because your book is diverse doesn't mean it's a good book, which has been the entire point of this video. I feel that this too has been trend, like diverse reading too has become a trend rather than a meaningful form of criticism and reading, because nowadays representation is not like something that should be just treated normally but more like something that should be praised regardless of whether or not the representation is good representation or if it is bad representation. Many popular characters of color are not very compelling, rather boring characters who feel like a token minority included in the book just to make the author feel better about themselves or to fill some pre-assumed diversity quota that will guarantee that your book will sell well among the people who fall in that same race or sexuality or gender as that one character that you are representing in your book. I think that if you're not going to write compelling characters of color, just don't write them. If you're not going to write compelling characters, don't give them this diversity quota to make them seem more interesting than they already are or to make them seem spicy. Now, I think that for a book like Hell Followed With Us, which, as I mentioned millions of times during this video, has a huge subsect of politics that is being discussed in this book, characters of colors and characters who have religions other than Christianity should not be written unless you're looking forward to discussing their identity with the dystopian aspect of the book that you're trying to portray. This book too has one throwaway line, as I previously mentioned, but that line does nothing to deepen the character that it is being said about. Most of the characters who are meant to be diverse here are just there for diversity. They have no voice in the narrative, they play no role in the narrative. They exist for the main character to feel guilty about, the main character to feel sad about, and the main character to feel conflicted about. Overall, Hell Followed With Us was 0.5 stars out for me. I had extremely high hopes for it, but we all live to be disappointed, don't we? I will not be reading any more books by Andrew Joseph White because I have decided that he is just not the author for me. This book overall is one that I would not recommend picking up unless you're looking for a quick read to get you out of a reading slump, because it is pretty fast paced. So that was it for today. Thank you for watching. Be safe during this pandemic and goodbye.